At the Speed Museum in Louisville, Kentucky, longtime board members Adele and Leonard Leight created a Glass Award, and Victoria Ahmadizadeh Melendez was selected as its first recipient. Her exhibition of neon installations was the subject of a feature article by William Ganis in the current edition of Glass. From the Brooklyn, New York studios of Urban Glass, this is GlassQuarterly Live, where we take a deep dive into the winter 2025 edition of Glass magazine with conversations with the writers, curators, and artists covered in the latest edition. I'm your host, Andrew Page, and we're glad you joined us for a closer look at our winter 2025 edition. Welcome to the 6th edition of GlassQuarterly Live, taking a deep dive into the winter 2025 edition of Glass magazine. And with me today is Victoria Ahmadizadeh Melendez, who was featured in an article written by William Ganis, who also joins us from Terre Haute, Indiana, where William is a professor of art at the University of Indiana, Terre Haute. Welcome, William.
Thank you.
And welcome to you, Victoria. Victoria is also an academic and is a professor at the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia, as well as an artist. Thank you so much for joining us today, Victoria.
Thank you.
Great. So I just wanted to start by asking you, this is an article about this installation at a museum, at the Speed Museum, and the very first iteration of the Adele and Leonard Leight Glass Award at the Speed Museum in Louisville. And you're the first recipient, and I was going to ask you, what was it like being the first recipient of a brand new residency and exhibition program? Was it something that came to you with a lot of restrictions or understanding and rules, or because it was new, was there a lot of opportunity to shape what that residency was?
Sure. Yeah, I found out about the award and the opportunity kind of out of the blue. So it was really a surprise. It was kind of really, really amazing that Scott Erbs, the curator of decorative arts at the Speed Art Museum, reached out to me and met with me over Zoom and told me about the award. And then he actually flew me out to Louisville to come see the Speed Museum because I had never been there before. That all took place in the summer of 2024. That's when I found out. And August 24 is when I was physically in the space, and we're kind of weighing our options in terms of where the work would be displayed for the unveiling, if I would be having a full-blown exhibition of my work or if it would just kind of be the commissioned piece. And some of this also depended on whether or not I was going to be making sort of more an object-based sculpture or, a wall piece or an installation that would take up a bigger room or bigger space. So they have Adele and Leonard's collection on display, part of it in the museum, and that area is flooded with natural light, which is really amazing for the work that's on display. But I was talking about utilizing neon in my piece. So
Not ideal
so it's not
conditions.
ideal to be flooded by daylight. So they also showed me the first gallery, I believe it's gallery 1 of the Contemporary Art Wing. And it's just a really beautiful room. It's part of the original Speed Museum building, so it has really cool architectural details. When we walked in, amazing people's work was on display, and I feel like that was the moment that things kind of hit me, where I was like, okay, this is real. This is happening. And it was a big room compared to the other space that we were looking at, parts of the collection. But I got to
That sounds like you kind of
look at that
upgraded.
and brainstorm a little bit first. And we ended up having kind of like a series of meetings throughout the year, like these checkpoints, to figure out, I basically had to design something and propose it. But it was very, very open. The curator, Scott Erbs, that I was working with was very, even sometimes I would ask his opinion about things and he would be like, well, whatever you want.
Well, that's nice.
I'd be like, okay.
Every artist's dream. But it also sounds, like though you were working with the curator of decorative arts, you ended up in the contemporary art wing. So it's very nice that the museum was flexible and perhaps, more appropriate for your work, which has a very strong conceptual aspect to it, which I'm so glad William is here. He did such an amazing job in the magazine to bring to light the many aspects of Victoria's work. And I wanted to ask you, William, what was it like to first encounter Victoria's installation at the Speed Art Museum in Louisville?
Well, I think the first thing I noticed was that there was this impressive scale. And my experience of her work before that was really through internet images. And while I knew that sometimes she could work large with certainly the links, those are large scale pieces. Most of what I encountered were usually smaller pieces. And also, just the camera distorts things. So coming into that space and seeing how the galleries were really activated by the neon, how they changed that atmospheric space. Gotta say that light, you felt like you could cut it with a knife. It was so wonderfully rich. So plus, seeing maybe that scale of the neon against perhaps pieces that were more pieces that would be produced in the hot shop, things that were made really through blowing techniques. And so there was this conversation between the pieces that maybe I knew from her website or maybe I had seen on her Instagram feed, but then there was this whole new dimension of scale and this whole new dimension of atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, media is, neon predominates and certainly makes a very strong impression atmospherically.
Mhm.
And it's also the line in many of the works. It's really notable how multimedia this was. I know it was a Glass Award and you brought it into the contemporary art gallery, literally. And also, I would say figuratively, in the sense that this was really in a contemporary use of neon as a component in multimedia work.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit, Victoria, about how you approach material and how you saw this in relation to glass?
Sure. Thank you for saying that, both of you. Wonderful remarks about my work.
How do you?
Material? Yeah. So I think something important to say first is that, my writing and poetry and language, that is a material for me, definitely a material for my work now. And people are always curious about what order that comes in. And
Mhm.
I think it's like a confluence of events, and it's a bit of a back and forth for sure. Um, this specific body of work for the commission, it originated really when I was an artist in residence at the Corning Museum of Glass in 2023. So I spent a month in the fall there, and I was able to research the ancient glass in their collection, like 13th century pieces from Iran and Egypt and Syria and just the surrounding area. And I started to try to replicate these forms with kind of a contemporary spin, using really bright colors, sometimes thinking about mirrorizing the glass, and then thinking about how these pieces could then figure back into works I had been doing before. Like a lot of people think of my candlestick pieces, two candlesticks connected by an arc. And I love how beautiful and simple that images and that metaphor is. But I did want to see, if I could, how much more complex I could go and how I could sort of evolve this idea. So thinking about what other forms I could use, and specifically, I was researching pre-electricity lighting devices, things that emit light, lanterns, candlesticks, all kinds of things like that. And it was really kind of interesting to look back into ancient times and see how people have been problem solving lighting, forever, and also making it something really, really special in sacred spaces. So all of this was kind of percolating for a while before I got the actual commission.
You mentioned words, which was I was actually leading up to in my question, because William, you really brought in not only a discussion of the way that text and poetry interacted in the works, but in fact actually quoting some of the poetry in the course of the article. So you really gave it a prime place in an article about Victoria's work. Can you talk a little bit about what drew you to the text in this case and why you felt it's so important to really highlight it in the?
Well, I think first of all, it's a sense of responsibility. It would be like showing half of a work if I didn't include some of those texts. And, yes, I know that Glass magazine is, of course, focused on glass, but I thought of those poems as integral to the work and really felt like we needed to not only just talk about them, but show them. One of the things that it dawned on me was actually kind of cool about the article is that, in reading the text, that would be the primary thing because you'd run into the text first instead of the material. And so I liked that maybe there was a different sort of primacy that you would see in the gallery. And so, I kind of grappled with that, thinking, do many people come and really look at that text, really look at the poetry? Do they simply think it's didactic? Do they ignore it altogether?
Mhm.
And, while I couldn't really answer those questions, I realized the value in the text having a deeper understanding of what was going on in that dialogue between text and object image. Also, just as a teacher, I feel like I'm always working with students, maybe often having that conversation about what should I title this? And I feel like every time I have that conversation, I say, when you make a title, it's actually kind of limiting. It helps people interpret, but you might also close off other interpretations. And I feel like Victoria's work and her poetry in a lot of ways does the opposite. Yeah, okay, maybe I'm a little bit constrained or I'm a little bit contained or I have a direction, but I feel like her poetry actually opens up possibilities for interpretation.
And Victoria, is that also something that we could say is, if not new, expanded in this body of work, the role of text in the finished works?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the first time yes, it is the first time where the entire poem itself is just the title of the piece, because usually, even though not many of my poems are like super duper long, but usually the title will be like a chunk, a line from a poem, or maybe two lines from a poem. So that was a little bit different, and at first I was kind of like, is it enough? Like, is it, and I think when you're kind of known for doing something, then you start to play with that in your brain, or you want to live up to that expectation, but you want to continue to experiment and grow and change. But I'd say it was just as important as ever. And just writing in general is so important to me to process what is going on. Like, what is going on in everyday life is not kind of a normal volume. And so having to live my daily life and um, also think about what it's like for my family abroad and in multiple locations. Writing really helps to process that. It's helped me to figure out my identity, aspects of my identity.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned identity, because I mean, I think that's certainly, as William points out in the article, quite important to understanding this work, or to this work being in its own way a search for connection to identity. And I would say identity is plural, because I know that as all of us embody multiple identities. However, I know in your case, there's two specific areas that your family comes from, and that you look a lot toward your own lineage in this work in particular. And maybe you might want to talk a little bit about that. I mean, you mentioned
Yeah,
some
well,
things about background.
sure. Well, the first thing that popped into my mind as you were speaking was, my goals changed as I grew into an adult and learned more and saw more of the world around me. When I was a little kid, I felt like the goal was to fit in and assimilate and be like the other kids at school. And, sometimes it was like confusing or even upsetting why my family was so different, because, wanting to have what your friends have or something like that. But also really appreciating the ways in which my family was different and added so much value to me, to my life as I was growing up, our culture and our background, hearing multiple languages spoken at home. Even just that, my parents were raised in two different religions. They are two different religions, so that as well was really formative for me. Just made me kind of, I think, more open. But when I was younger, I think in public, it wasn't like my cultural background wasn't something I was bringing up a lot. It was more something I was trying to kind of like tone down. And then, as I became a more established artist, became a professional artist, and I was making work, and it was really when I got my MFA at VCU that I started to incorporate text into my work and my writing into my work. When I was getting my MFA at VCU, it wasn't the first time I had ever made work about my identity or even like gender and things like that. I did start to dive deeper into that, and I also started to use my poetry as part of my work and bringing text into the work, both physically and as kind of like this background thing informing it. So, and then coming out of that, I think it's like I thought there was something really amazing actually that you wrote about, William, in the article, where you're kind of saying that like my work is not directly political or maybe even like directly about my identity, but
Mhm,
but it also is.
mhm,
But it
mhm.
kind of gets at it in a different way. And I feel like I can't even put it into words now, but you managed to put it into words. And I was reading the article and I was like, yes, like he
Wow,
understands.
that's the best thing a writer can hear. So I'm sure
It's
William is
it's wonderful to hear.
exceedingly happy to hear this. But
Yeah,
William, why don't we hear more about that?
can I just say something about that? And I think that there's, we hear this so much in the academic world where we may have students. I mean, it can go with any group of people, any identity, whether it's an African American student saying, oh gosh, what does Plato have to do with me? Or a white student saying, what does Toni Morrison have to do with me? And I think that sometimes there is a sense of wondering, well, if I see art from one person or another, or one group or another, can I relate to it? And in a lot of ways, I read, of course, I saw the components that had to do with Persia, with Islamic art, with the very personal messages as well. But what I discovered about her work when I really thought about it, and maybe the poetry did have a big input with this thought, is that it's really about the search for identity. And that's something that's universal. I think that most of us don't, have a fixed sense, or it evolves, it changes. Some of us are more in tune with that. Some of us are more comfortable with maybe a settled sense of identity than others. But I do feel like it's a universal question. At some point in our lives, we want to know where we come from, who we are, why we are the way we are.
Yes. And it's always incomplete. And this is also really important, I think, to William's article, was how the incompleteness of anyone's knowledge, looking back in time, grasping for information, whether it's visual information, factual information, historic information, we never know completely. So we are constantly weaving together that sense of identity. And that was something that was so poignantly brought forward about your work, Victoria, that I think William really, to build on what you were just saying, William, really not only, was able to feel that, but also to really eloquently express that and relate it to the exhibition.
A number of the designs that I made in neon for the piece, or, I think of the piece as like a triptych. And a lot of that neon imagery came from Persian carpet designs. And these ended up being designs that, I'd kind of be somewhere, I'd be out in a public place or maybe someone else's house or something. And I would notice the rug on the floor and kind of just start taking pictures of the ground. And, I think when I was younger, I wanted to like assimilate whatever that means. But you know, I talk about the found Persian carpet designs as this sort of idea of like, my culture is actually everywhere. It's a huge influence. You know what I mean? It's influenced a lot of glassmaking. It's influenced
Mhm.
aspects of American culture.
Um,
Um, it's just right there in plain view. So I don't know. There's just like small revelations that happen as you grow older and have more life experiences, and family becomes more important, and learning about my ancestors has become more important to me. But I think that does happen for a lot of people.
One of my favorite things about you're talking about identity is that you always note when somebody is creative. You always note, my grandfather did this awesome carving.
Mhm.
you know, my mother's sisters were just amazing working with clothing and working with textiles. And I love that you note that, and love that you sort of think about your own creativity as being a factor of those folks' abilities.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, uh, yeah, I guess to speak to what you were mentioning, yeah, probably everyone on my mom's side of the family can sew. My mom can sew really well, but her mom was a seamstress and professionally tailored and sewed outfits for people. And then, yeah, my dad's father, when he was younger, he did a lot of like these architectural details, like
Mhm.
moldings with really elaborate carved plaster designs of like birds and flowers and vines. And, I asked my dad if these things were cast in a mold and then adhered to the wall. And he was like, oh no, he carved them.
Oh,
So I was like, wow, why did no one ever mention this, And they just didn't connect it as like similar to what I do, but it absolutely is. It's incredibly creative. And yeah, there's a mirror mosaic that he made that, I made part of my piece for the Speed Museum references his mirror mosaic, but it's just this kind of thing that like I picture it in my brain all the time. And I've just kind of seen like a brief video of it actually. And my family wants to send me more. I've like mentioned that I'm interested in it. They want to send me more photos and more photos of that house in general. But it's like interesting what symbols kind of stick with you when there's so much Persian iconography that I could use.
and it's interesting that you're also like being very selective and also transposing these motifs that you're noticing and documenting and then incorporating into your work. You're creating something else, and I think that's really notable as well. Like, there are people who explore their heritage by remaking, things from the past,
Yeah.
copying them, or doing something to preserve something that is perhaps in another medium, and they're making it in glass. You are actually really very actively altering what you see and putting together things in new ways. And I think that's really notable as well. And I don't know, William, if you had something to add to that.
Well, I think the expressionistic quality of the work really comes through. Of course, it's informed by some of the stories that Victoria tells that, talking about maybe that unbelievable feeling of acceptance when she met her aunt. And then, I connect that to things like, I'm sorry if I don't get the title right, but the work that has the Persian ewer, and then it feels like you've got this efflorescence of light coming from that ewer, just that sort of pouring forth. And, I see those connections. How do you express that? What would you say? A feeling of complete acceptance and understanding? How do you express a feeling of somebody's, my gosh, just complete love? And, I'm making those connections with your stories. And part of the light is not just formal, it's definitely emotionally expressive. And there are parts of the story, parts of your story that come across to the viewer. And in a lot of ways, feeling that immersion, in a lot of ways, feeling that, what should we say, almost totality that you talk about.
What was the reception in Louisville, Victoria, to your work, and what was it like
Yeah.
to have that dialogue with that community?
Right. I mean, the the at the opening, people were really enthusiastic. People were really kind. Lecture was really well attended, and because I gave my lecture at the public opening, and actually, I was very struck at the end of my lecture when they opened up questions. There were people just kind of asking simple questions like you talk about trying to find your identity, like how do I do that or whatever, like the question wasn't exactly that, but
Right.
William was there, so maybe you sort of remember the
I
tone
heard
of
some of those,
these
yes.
questions. I was a little caught off guard because I thought, I thought people would be like, how'd you make this glass thing or
Right.
whatever, like more technical or something. And instead, yeah, they were really caught by this sort of personal part of the work. And yeah, the answer is you just kind of have to like go on your journey and make your way through it. And, I feel like realizing that I didn't have to learn about all of Puerto Rican culture from my mom and all of Persian culture from my dad. Like I could go out and buy a cookbook and learn how to cook different dishes from my culture on my own. I could read books and watch a million different things out there. And even that sounds really simple, but that was just like a revelation to me too, that I could just take it upon myself to inherit, whatever ancestry identity that I wanted to. So, and yeah, part of wanting to do that is like feeling some of these feelings when I am able to connect with my family, both present and
Yeah. And what would be, William, your sense of the universality? You mentioned that earlier in the conversation that, while there were specific, culture cited and specific histories, in the end, there was a sense that Victoria had successfully taken it out of the specific into something larger and wider.
Hmm.
Two questions would be, one would be, what do you think in the essence of her work was able to elevate it to that universal level? And
Hmm.
what was the final, the impact on the work's ability to speak to you? What was,
Well, I think in a few different ways. One, I feel like to understand Victoria's work, you do have to make an investment. You do have to take a moment. You'll get a completely different understanding if you spend, like so many people do, 30 seconds in front of an artwork and move on. But taking the time to read the poetry, taking the time to see connections across work, the very personal piece that she does a few different times now about showing her process and showing her thoughts and the evolution of ideas. As you said, they're reflections of your own studio and studio wall. That's very personal. And I suppose in another way, that's also a question of identity, but maybe artistic identity or artistic ability, because frankly, you seem to trace many of your newfound skills across that work as it evolves. So again, I think that probably somebody won't get it if they're doing a quick look, but hopefully folks are intrigued enough to start to read the poetry, start to think about how the works interrelate. And then I think there's a much, much deeper connection. Then I think that there's going to, I don't think it would be just me doing the deep read for the article, but I think that most people, if they make some investment with reading her poetry, are going to start to come away with that understanding of the search for identity. Not to mention just some of the poetry is intriguing. It's fun to read. It's, there's some real gems. I can't quote it, unfortunately, but there are just a few lines that really grab me in the way that Roland Barthes talks about the punctum, that thing that grabs you, the thing
Mhm.
um, you know, there are those moments where I see it first in the poetry and then I understand the work better. So yeah, that's my takeaway.
Mhm.
Do you mind if I just wanted to bring up another issue with the situation of the speed and this
Mhm.
award? And I'm realizing how important this is to have a collection that feels like it's alive and it grows and it changes, and that this Light Award is really going to do something for that collection, for all of the artists involved in that collection. Because I'm starting to see this now where I've written about the Glit collection at
Mm.
Newfields, and they really don't do anything new with it. It's kind of the way that it was installed, I suppose, 8 years ago. It's still more or less the same. The curators don't really know what to do with it. Maybe I see this a little bit at Huntsville too, where the collection seems like it's a great collection, but it doesn't really seem like a living collection. And so I love this for the Light collection. I always love to see what's new at Corning with the Rakow collection or commission. And I think it's really important that the Speed does this. Maybe I would also add, Stephen Rolfe Powell, he cast a long shadow in Kentucky. And it's great to see, how he was so instrumental in getting Glass off the ground. And while, I know he's a part of the collection there, it's really just great to also see Leight in Kentucky in the Midwest is changing, and, how his legacy has left space for this kind of growth and new interpretation.
And just a technical question. So, Victoria, some of this work will remain, right, as part of the Light collection, or one of this pieces, or all of it?
Yeah, so the show's come down and the triptych is staying with the Speed Art Museum as part of their collection now. So I did tell them I stipulated that they could show one panel at a time if they wanted to. I do think it's really special that for my show and the unveiling, it was kind of all together on one side of the room. If you're not familiar, it was kind of boxed in. So the light was really contained in that side of the room, and it felt like a bit of a sanctuary space. So I do love when the installation can have that effect, but I gave them permission to show one panel at a time as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm.
Great. That's great. And I guess as we're winding down this conversation, what would be the next steps for you, Victoria? Maybe you would like to share maybe how this informs the next thing that you're working on?
Wow, that's a big question. So you know, It was a really amazing award kind of for the time that I'm at, or the really specifically the time I was at when I received it. I was like just starting to try to freelance. I was doing my adjunct teaching position at Tyler, and then I would also have another teaching position somewhere else or another part-time job somewhere else, and then I would be exhibiting and making my work. But after I got back from the courting residency, I stopped doing that and was like, I just want to focus on making my work and um teaching at Tyler at one place. So, you know, it came through at just the right time to support that. And so, I'm trying to continue that. And, I love both teaching and making my work. I don't think it's a goal to like eliminate teaching or anything like that, but it certainly has been incredible to have more opportunities to show my work and opportunities that are supported where I can afford materials, I can afford my cost of living while I'm making the work, and not just sort of like being maybe someone buying something or being paid at the very end.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time. I know you're teaching today. And so thank you so much for making time at the end of your teaching schedule to join us. And William as well. Thank you for at the end of your lectures for the day coming to this Glass Quarterly live recording. So really appreciate your time today.
I'd like to add a thank you to Victoria for trusting me because I think that we dove into some very, very personal, very, very vulnerable places. And she was always just so forthcoming and wonderful to work with. But I really do appreciate that, again, that trust because it, I think, helped me to make a better article and to, in a lot of ways, be able to articulate hopefully some of the ideas that you have.
Yeah, I mean, it really is I mean, that's what I was very proud of being able to have this article appear in the magazine. As I was telling William earlier, the way this is really like what the magazine can do at its best. It's really
Mhm.
to capture something that is, and to provide a context for it and to provide insight and a pathway into it. And I also really appreciated, William, how you talked about like the contrast. I know you're sort of building sort of a wider view of what's happening in Kentucky, but like, you look at something like Stephen Powell's gorgeous, very object-based work that is just a celebration of glass and color. And then you go into something like what we're seeing at the Speed Museum with Victoria's work, and you really see how the field itself is evolving into more complex territory and much more sort of broad in its concerns. And it's really wonderful to see. And that the museum is making that connection between the days of early glass and today and moving it forward. As William was pointing out, I think it's really encouraging and exciting. So, on that note, thank you so much for being a part of Glass Quarterly Live number 6. And we look forward to seeing what the future holds for both of you and your work in your respective areas. Thank you so much.
Thank you.